The metal door resisted at first, decades of rust and neglect having fused it to the frame like some ancient seal meant to keep secrets buried forever. When it finally surrendered with a groan that echoed across the empty Connecticut countryside, the smell hit immediately. Musty leather, aged oil, and something else, something indescribable that could only be the scent of automotive history decomposing in darkness. The flashlight beam cut through air thick with dust particles that danced like disturbed spirits, and what it illuminated defied belief. Shapes lurked beneath rotting canvas covers, curves and edges suggesting forms that shouldn't exist in a place like this, shouldn't be forgotten, shouldn't be possible. The first cover came away in pieces, fabric disintegrating at the touch, and there it was. A 1967 Ferrari 275 GTB/4, its Russell Corsa paint dulled by grime but unmistakable, sitting on flat tires surrounded by its own scattered pieces like a fallen monarch in exile. But this wasn't just one car. The flashlight swept further into the cavernous space, revealing row after row of shrouded vehicles stretching back into shadows that seemed to have no end. Each shape promised another impossibility, another treasure that the world had declared lost or destroyed, sitting here in silence while the years turned to decades and the outside world forgot they existed. This wasn't a barn find. This was an automotive Pompeii, a moment frozen in time when someone had simply walked away from a fortune that would eventually grow to dwarf the GDP of small nations, leaving these mechanical masterpieces to face their slow dissolution alone, unwatched, unmourned, and utterly priceless. The discovery didn't begin with intention, but with death, as so many great revelations do. Marcus Webb hadn't been searching for legendary automotives when he accepted the executor position for the estate of Leonard Ashford, a reclusive industrialist whose passing at 93 had surprised no one, least of all the handful of distant relatives who appeared solely to discuss their inheritance. The Ashford estate sprawled across 200 acres of prime Connecticut real estate, featuring a deteriorating Victorian mansion that hadn't seen meaningful maintenance since the Carter administration, and enough overgrown outbuildings to constitute a small village. The family wanted everything liquidated quickly, the land sold to developers, the house demolished, the contents auctioned off to whoever would pay. But property law required a complete inventory first, which meant Marcus trudging through every structure on the grounds, cataloging forgotten furniture and worthless junk that would ultimately feed a dumpster. He'd worked through 17 buildings over 3 days, finding nothing but the expected detritus of a long life lived increasingly disconnected from reality, when he noticed the 18th structure on the survey map, set far back from the main house, obscured by overgrown maples and accessible only by a gravel road that had long since surrendered to nature. The building itself looked like any other barn, weathered wood and a sagging roofline, completely unremarkable, except for the unusually heavy padlock securing its entrance and the fact that none of the relatives had mentioned it even once during the estate proceedings. Comente abaixo de qual cidade você está assistindo a este vídeo para eu saber até onde a nossa história chegou. Standing in that doorway with his flashlight revealing impossible silhouettes, Marcus felt his hands begin to shake, not from fear, but from the sudden understanding that his life had just cleaved into 2 distinct periods, before this moment and everything that would come after. The Ferrari sat closest to the entrance, its presence alone enough to constitute a significant discovery, but it represented merely the introduction to what lay beyond. He stepped carefully across the concrete floor, noting how everything had been arranged with deliberate precision, each vehicle positioned with exact spacing, suggesting that whoever had placed them here had done so with purpose and care, rather than haphazard abandonment. The second cover revealed a 1961 Jaguar E-Type, one of the earliest production models, its opalescent silver paint barely visible beneath accumulated grime, but its iconic shape unmistakable even in decay. Marcus's breathing had become shallow, his mind struggling to process what his eyes reported. These weren't simply old cars. These were specific, legendary examples of automotive engineering that serious collectors spent lifetimes pursuing. Vehicles that appeared on auction wish lists with estimates preceded by multiple zeros. Cars that museums negotiated for years to acquire. And they were just sitting here, had been sitting here, decomposing in isolation, while the world assumed them lost to accidents, scrapyards, or foreign collections beyond reach. He moved deeper into the building, pulling covers with increasingly frantic energy, each revelation more stunning than the last. A 1957 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Goldwing, its distinctive doors closed like wings at rest. A 1963 Aston Martin DB5, the same model that would achieve fame in cinema, but predating that celebrity. A 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona, its absurd wing and nose cone looking like science fiction even under decades of dust. A 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda in plum crazy purple, one of the rarest muscle cars ever produced. A 1953 Corvette, among the first 300 ever built. A 1936 Bugatti Type 57 SC Atlantic, a car so rare that only 4 were ever created, and the automotive world believed only 2 still existed. Except now there were 3, because the third sat right here, its riveted bodywork unmistakable despite the cobwebs draped across it like funeral shrouds. Marcus counted 38 vehicles in total, arranged in 6 careful rows, each one a masterpiece, each one worth a fortune individually, their collective value climbing toward figures that seemed fictional. The building's interior showed signs of climate control equipment that had long since failed. Dehumidifiers standing silent sentinels over a battle against entropy they'd ultimately lost, their circuits surrendered to time and electrical failure. Water damage marked the far corner where the roof had clearly leaked for years, moisture seeping down to claim at least 3 vehicles in various states of corrosive decay. Birds had found their way inside through gaps in the siding, their nests built atop hoods and trunks, their droppings adding to the chemical assault on paint and metal. Rodents had chewed through wiring harnesses and upholstery, making homes in engine bays and interior spaces, their generations having lived and died within these automotive cathedrals without understanding the historical significance of their nesting sites. Yet despite the damage, despite the neglect and the slow dissolution, the collection remained essentially intact, a time capsule of automotive excellence waiting for someone to remember it existed. The first call Marcus made wasn't to the Ashford family but to Daniel Chen, a classic car specialist he'd worked with on previous estate sales, someone whose expertise and discretion could be trusted when dealing with discoveries that would inevitably attract attention from every direction. Daniel arrived within 3 hours, driving up from Manhattan with a speed that suggested he hadn't entirely believed Marcus's stammered phone description but wasn't willing to risk the possibility of it being true. His reaction upon entering the barn provided Marcus with the validation he needed that his assessment hadn't been the product of wishful thinking or ignorant misidentification. Daniel stood frozen just inside the doorway, his expression cycling through disbelief, shock, and something approaching religious awe before he finally managed to speak, his voice barely above a whisper, as though raising it might shatter the vision before him or alert whatever forces had allowed this collection to remain hidden for so long. They spent the next 6 hours documenting everything, photographing each vehicle from multiple angles, recording VIN numbers and engine codes, noting conditions and visible damage, building the evidentiary record that would be required when this discovery inevitably became public. Daniel's hands trembled as he worked, occasionally stopping to simply stare at particular vehicles with the expression of someone encountering creatures they'd believed mythological suddenly made flesh before them. The Bugatti alone represented a discovery that would reshape the classic car market, its value impossible to accurately estimate because the only comparable sales involved the other 2 known examples. Transactions that had occurred privately for undisclosed sums rumored to exceed $30 million. The Ferrari 275 GTB4 would command several million at auction under normal circumstances. The Goldwing Mercedes, the E-Type Jaguar, the Aston Martin, each represented seven-figure valuations at minimum, their worth compounding based on originality, provenance, and the simple fact of their survival. But the collection's value transcended simple mathematical addition of individual car prices. This was an assemblage, a curated gathering that told a story about automotive history, about preservation and loss, about one person's vision executed with resources sufficient to acquire vehicles that rarely appeared on any market at any price. The whole exceeded its parts, the narrative value amplifying the monetary worth into territory where normal pricing mechanisms broke down entirely, where the only meaningful number would be whatever someone with sufficient wealth decided it was worth to them personally. Daniel's preliminary estimate, delivered with multiple caveats about market volatility and the need for expert authentication, placed the collection's value at minimum $45 million, potentially climbing past $60 million depending on restoration possibilities and provenance documentation. These weren't numbers Marcus had ever encountered in his estate work, weren't figures that felt real when attached to objects currently covered in bird droppings and slowly being consumed by rust. Yet the evidence sat undeniable before them, slowly rotting in the Connecticut countryside, while the world beyond these walls continued in complete ignorance of what waited here. The question of how this had happened, how a collection of this magnitude could simply be forgotten, led Marcus into Leonard Ashford's history with the persistence of a detective pursuing a cold case. The relatives knew remarkably little about the deceased's life, their connection to him so distant and infrequently maintained that their knowledge barely exceeded what a casual internet search would reveal. But estate papers told stories that living relatives couldn't, and Marcus dove into decades of documentation with the intensity of someone who understood that the why of this situation mattered as much as the what. Leonard Ashford had been born in 1930 to a family whose wealth derived from manufacturing, specifically the production of specialized components for military and industrial applications. His father had built the business during World War II, and Leonard had expanded it during the Cold War, government contracts providing the kind of steady, enormous revenue that allowed for the accumulation of truly absurd wealth far from public scrutiny. Unlike many of his generation's wealthy elite, Leonard had shunned publicity, avoided social circuits, and generally conducted his life with a privacy that in the modern era would be nearly impossible to maintain. He'd married once, briefly, in the early 1960s, a union that had lasted less than 3 years and produced no children before ending in a divorce whose settlement documents suggested mutual relief rather than acrimony. After that, he'd lived alone in the Connecticut estate, running his business empire through intermediaries and trusted executives, while personally pursuing interests that remained largely unknown to anyone outside his immediate household staff. Those staff members were all deceased now, the last one having passed away in 2003, leaving no one who could speak to Leonard's daily life during the crucial decades when the car collection had presumably been assembled. But financial records told their own story, a trail of purchases and payments that Marcus pieced together with growing fascination. The buying had begun in 1965 with the acquisition of a 1957 Mercedes 300 SL, the same car now sitting in the barn, purchased from a private seller in California for what was then considered a substantial but not outrageous sum. More purchases followed throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, a period when classic cars hadn't yet achieved their current stratospheric valuations, when vehicles now worth millions could be acquired for thousands or tens of thousands, when a knowledgeable buyer with sufficient capital could assemble a world-class collection for less than what a single example would cost decades later. Leonard had been that knowledgeable buyer, his purchases suggesting sophisticated understanding of automotive significance, an ability to identify vehicles that would prove historically important long before the broader market recognized their value. The Bugatti had been purchased in 1972 from an estate sale in France for $80,000, a price that seemed astronomical at the time, but represented perhaps 1/400th of its current value.
The Ferrari came from an Italian collector in 1969. The Hemi Cuda had been bought directly from a Dodge dealer in 1970, a special order vehicle that Leonard had apparently acquired and immediately stored without ever registering it for road use. The purchases continued through the 1970s and into the early 1980s, each edition carefully selected, each acquisition representing another piece of automotive history removed from circulation and brought to Connecticut. Then, in 1984, the purchases stopped. Not slowed, not reduced, stopped completely, as though someone had flipped a switch turning off Leonard's interest in classic cars. The financial records showed no more automotive acquisitions, no payments to dealers or private sellers, no auction purchases, nothing that suggested any continued engagement with what had clearly been a passionate pursuit.
Marcus found the answer in medical records that Leonard's privacy concerns hadn't extended to destroying documents that painted a picture of a man struck down in his prime by a stroke that, while not immediately fatal, had left him significantly impaired. The stroke had occurred in March 1984, when Leonard was only 54 years old, young enough that he'd probably expected decades more to enjoy his collection, to continue acquiring pieces, to perhaps eventually share his treasures with museums or enthusiasts. Instead, he'd found himself struggling with partial paralysis, cognitive difficulties, and a recovery process that the medical notes suggested was frustratingly incomplete. The man who emerged from rehabilitation was physically diminished and, more importantly for the fate of his automotive treasures, seemed to have lost interest in the pursuits that had previously defined his private life. His business continued under management he'd previously established, the revenue continuing to flow, maintaining his wealth but not requiring his active participation. The estate staff kept the house running, kept him fed and cared for, but apparently no one thought to check on the barn that sat isolated at the property's edge, the building that housed a fortune in gradually deteriorating automobiles. Or perhaps they had checked, found the cars sitting in their careful rows, and assumed this was exactly as Leonard wanted them, not understanding that the man who would have maintained them, who would have supervised their care and preservation, no longer fully existed, his passions and attention scattered by the same neurological event that had weakened his body. Years became decades, Leonard's health declining in incremental stages, his world shrinking to the mansion's immediate rooms, his staff retiring or passing away without replacement as his social isolation deepened into something approaching complete withdrawal from the world beyond his property lines. The relatives who would eventually inherit maintained minimal contact, obligatory phone calls on holidays and birthday cards sent more from habit than affection, none of them aware that their distant relation was sitting atop a fortune in classic cars, none of them knowing to ask about the locked barn that appeared on no recent property surveys because it had been deliberately omitted from documentation for privacy reasons Leonard himself had probably long forgotten. When Leonard finally died in his sleep on a February night in 2024, he'd been alone in the mansion except for a part-time caretaker who visited 3 times weekly. His passing peaceful and unremarkable, his obituary a brief notice in the local paper that mentioned his business success but said nothing about the passions that had defined his private hours or the collection that represented perhaps the greatest automotive treasure trove assembled by a single individual during the 20th century. And so the cars sat, as they'd sat for 40 years, slowly succumbing to entropy, while the world beyond the barn walls transformed, while the classic car market exploded in value, while collectors and museums desperately sought the very vehicles that were quietly dissolving in a Connecticut barn that no one remembered to check.
But someone had checked, Marcus discovered, and this revelation opened an entirely new dimension to the mystery. Deep in Leonard's personal papers, filed in a folder marked simply Property Maintenance, Marcus found correspondence from 2006. Letters from a restoration specialist named Graham Worth, who had apparently been contacted by someone, the letters didn't specify who, about assessing the barn's contents. Worth's letters described his visit to the property, his shock at discovering the collection, and his detailed recommendations for immediate action to prevent further deterioration. He'd outlined a comprehensive plan involving climate control restoration, individual car assessments, careful documentation, and staged restoration work that would cost an estimated $2 million, but would preserve vehicles worth exponentially more. The letters grew increasingly urgent over a 6-month period, Worth's professional calm gradually giving way to barely contained frustration as his communications apparently went unanswered or were met with responses that the existing documentation didn't include. The final letter, dated November 2006, was brief and cold. Worth thanking Leonard for his time, but noting that without commitment to preservation measures, he couldn't in good conscience continue to advise on the collection, and wishing him well in whatever decisions he chose to make regarding the vehicles. What decisions had Leonard made? The evidence suggested none, that Worth's visit and recommendations had simply been filed away and forgotten. The proposed preservation work never initiated, the deterioration allowed to continue unchecked. But who had contacted Worth in the first place? Leonard himself seemed unlikely given his condition by 2006, his medical records indicating significant cognitive decline by that point. Had one of the estate staff taken initiative? Had a relative somehow learned of the collection and briefly considered doing something before losing interest or being prevented by Leonard's refusal? The mystery deepened when Marcus found a second folder, this one containing letters from 1995, a full decade before Worth's involvement, from a different automotive specialist named Patricia Hernandez. Her correspondence followed a similar pattern: initial contact by unknown party, visit to the property, comprehensive assessment, urgent recommendations, growing frustration, eventual withdrawal. And before that, in 1988, just 4 years after Leonard's stroke, Marcus found a handwritten letter from someone named Robert Chen, possibly Daniel's father or uncle given the surname, offering to help preserve the collection after what he described as a chance encounter with Leonard at a medical appointment. The pattern suggested that people kept discovering the collection, kept trying to save it, and kept being thwarted by some combination of Leonard's incapacity, administrative inertia, and simple bad luck that prevented preservation from occurring despite multiple opportunities over multiple decades. The authentication process began in earnest once the estate's legal representatives had been properly notified and the full implications of the barn's contents had penetrated through layers of bureaucracy to reach decision-makers who understood what had been found. The family's initial interest in quick liquidation transformed into something more measured when their attorney explained that hasty action with assets of this magnitude would constitute a breach of fiduciary duty and potentially expose everyone involved to litigation from beneficiaries who might argue that proper value hadn't been realized. Daniel Chen brought in a team of specialists, each one a recognized authority in their specific automotive niche, their collective expertise necessary to properly authenticate and assess vehicles whose provenance would be questioned simply because their existence in one place seemed too fortunate to be credible. The Bugatti received particular scrutiny, 3 separate experts flying in from Europe to examine the car over a painstaking 4-day period, their analysis involving everything from metallurgical testing of body components to examination of casting marks on engine blocks. Each test designed to confirm that this was indeed chassis number 57591, the third Atlantic, the car that had disappeared from public record in 1938 and was assumed destroyed during World War II. The authentication process revealed a story of its own, documentation hidden in the car's spare tire well including original purchase papers and a history tracing its journey from factory to French collector to wartime concealment to post-war sale to an American serviceman who'd shipped it home as personal property, eventually selling it to Leonard 3 owners later in a transaction that had never been publicly recorded because neither party had seen reason to broadcast their business. The Ferrari's authentication proved simpler but no less fascinating, its VIN matching records of a car commissioned with specific customization by its original owner, a Hollywood director whose estate sale Leonard had apparently purchased it from. The vehicle having been driven less than 8,000 miles before Leonard acquired it and presumably 0 miles afterward.
Each car told similar stories, trajectories that had led them from creation to Leonard's possession through paths that made sense when examined individually, but collectively seemed almost impossibly fortunate, as though Leonard had possessed either extraordinary luck or extraordinary knowledge that allowed him to acquire vehicles that would prove to be among the most significant examples of their respective models. The authentication process also confirmed the worst fears about condition, multiple vehicles showing damage that ranged from cosmetic to potentially terminal, restorations that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars per car and in some cases might prove impossible without compromising the very originality that gave the vehicles their value. The 3 cars in the corner where water damage had been most severe presented the gravest challenges, corrosion having penetrated deep into chassis components, body panels showing perforation, mechanical elements seized from moisture intrusion. 2 of those 3, a 1955 Mercedes 300 SL Roadster and a 1969 Chevrolet Camaro ZL1, might yet be saved with extensive work, but the third, a 1964 Shelby Cobra Daytona Coupe, had suffered damage that multiple specialists agreed had likely destroyed it as a viable vehicle, its value now primarily as a parts donor or a cautionary tale about preservation neglect. The 3 cars in the corner where water damage had been most severe presented the gravest challenges, corrosion having penetrated deep into chassis components, body panels showing perforation, mechanical elements seized from moisture intrusion. 2 of those 3, a 1955 Mercedes 300 SL Roadster and a 1969 Chevrolet Camaro ZL1, might yet be saved with extensive work, but the third, a 1964 Shelby Cobra Daytona Coupe, had suffered damage that multiple specialists agreed had likely destroyed it as a viable vehicle, its value now primarily as a parts donor or a cautionary tale about preservation neglect.
The decision about what to do with the collection sparked immediate conflict among the various parties who suddenly discovered they had strong opinions about automotive treasures they hadn't known existed weeks earlier. The Ashford family's representatives advocated for immediate sale, preferably as a complete collection to a single buyer who would pay premium for the ensemble, their motivation transparently financial and their concern for the vehicle's historical significance essentially non-existent. Several museums expressed interest in acquiring specific vehicles, their curators making impassioned cases for why particular cars belonged in public collections rather than private hands, their arguments compelling from a historical preservation standpoint, but complicated by the fact that their acquisition budgets couldn't approach fair market value for vehicles of this caliber. The classic car auction houses circled like sharks scenting blood, representatives from the major firms personally visiting the barn to make their cases for why their particular auction would realize maximum value, their estimates climbing in competitive escalation until the figures being discussed routinely exceeded $50 million for the complete collection. Private collectors emerged from various corners of the globe, wealthy individuals whose names Marcus recognized from business news offering to purchase everything sight unseen. Their proposed figures substantial but generally below what auction estimates suggested the cars might bring individually. The classic car auction houses circled like sharks scenting blood, representatives from the major firms personally visiting the barn to make their cases for why their particular auction would realize maximum value, their estimates climbing in competitive escalation until the figures being discussed routinely exceeded $50 million for the complete collection. Private collectors emerged from various corners of the globe, wealthy individuals whose names Marcus recognized from business news offering to purchase everything sight unseen. Their proposed figures substantial, but generally below what auction estimates suggested the cars might bring individually. And then there were the preservationists, passionate advocates who argued that the collection should be kept together, that its value lay not just in individual vehicles, but in the story it told, that breaking it apart would constitute cultural vandalism regardless of the financial returns such dispersal might generate. Marcus found himself unexpectedly sympathetic to this final group, his weeks of research into Leonard's history having created a connection to the man and his vision that made the prospect of scattering the collection to maximize profit feel somehow like betrayal.
But his role was executor, not curator. His responsibility to the estate and its beneficiaries, not to abstract principles of automotive preservation or the memory of a man he'd never met. The compromise that eventually emerged satisfied no one completely, but provided a framework everyone could accept. The collection would be offered first as a complete lot to qualified buyers who would commit to keep it intact and eventually providing public access, either through museum donation or scheduled exhibition. If no acceptable offer materialized within 6 months, individual vehicles would be sold through a combination of museum placements for the most historically significant examples and auction sales for the remainder, proceeds divided among beneficiaries according to estate documents. The Shelby Cobra, damaged beyond practical restoration, would be donated to an automotive restoration school where students could learn from its dismantling and perhaps salvage enough components to eventually contribute to other Cobra's preservation. The announcement, when it finally came, detonated across the automotive world like a shaped charge, its impact focused but devastating to everything in its radius. Publications that served the classic car community led with the story, their coverage mixing authentication details with speculation about final dispositions and wondering what other collections might be waiting in forgotten barns across the world. Mainstream media picked up the narrative, attracted by the dollar figures and the human interest angle of treasures abandoned and rediscovered. Their reporting less technically accurate, but reaching audiences who'd never heard of Bugatti Type 57 Atlantics, but could appreciate the drama of $50 million rotting in rural Connecticut. Social media exploded with automotive enthusiasts sharing details, photographs leaked from the authentication process despite confidentiality agreements, conspiracy theories about whether the whole thing was elaborate marketing for an upcoming auction. And the offers began arriving, expressions of interest from buyers whose identities remained carefully obscured, but whose financial capacity was vouched for by the private banks and wealth management firms representing them. Figures being discussed that started at $45 million and climbed toward numbers that made even the optimistic initial estimate seem conservative.
Yet even as the business of disposition proceeded, Marcus found himself drawn back to the barn, spending hours among the slowly dying cars, contemplating the story they represented and the questions that remained unanswered. Who had Leonard Ashford really been beneath the bare facts of his biography? What had driven his passion for these specific vehicles? Had he planned to eventually share them, to create a museum or open the collection to enthusiasts? Plans curtailed by the stroke that had rewritten his life? Or had the privacy that characterized everything about him extended to his automotive passion? The collection, never intended for outside eyes, meant only for his personal appreciation. The barn itself offered few clues, its interior purely functional, nothing suggesting the kind of shrine-like devotion some collectors created around their treasures. The cars had been stored efficiently, protected as well as circumstances allowed, but without the elaborate climate control and preservation measures that truly serious collectors employed. It suggested someone who loved these vehicles, but perhaps not obsessively, who enjoyed acquiring them, but may not have been primarily focused on their preservation for posterity. Or perhaps it simply reflected the practical reality that the barn and its contents represented just one aspect of a complex life. That Leonard had intended to upgrade the storage facility eventually, plans overtaken by medical catastrophe before they could be implemented. The more Marcus learned, the more he realized how little could be truly known about Leonard's interior life, about the thoughts and feelings that had accompanied his acquisition of each vehicle, about what these machines had meant to him personally beyond their obvious monetary and historical value. The correspondence Marcus had found painted a picture of a man who'd become isolated not by choice but by circumstance, whose connection to his passion had been severed by neurological damage, who'd spent the final 40 years of his life physically near but emotionally disconnected from treasures he'd once carefully selected and preserved. It was, Marcus thought during one of his solitary barn visits, a peculiarly modern tragedy. Not the dramatic kind that made for easy narratives, but the slow, grinding sadness of potential unfulfilled,
of plans unmade, of silence where connection might have been. The cars sat as monuments to that waste, their deterioration a physical manifestation of opportunities lost, of the gap between what might have been and what was. But they also represented resilience, the fact that despite 40 years of neglect, despite water damage and rust and rodent infestation, despite everything that should have destroyed them completely, they persisted, battered but fundamentally intact, their essential character surviving even when the conditions surrounding them had become actively hostile to their existence. In that persistence, Marcus found something approaching hope, or if not hope, then at least meaning. The suggestion that things worth preserving could survive even profound neglect if their fundamental construction was sound enough. That rescue remained possible even when circumstances suggested otherwise. That forgotten treasures waited everywhere for people willing to look beyond the obvious and ask what else might be there.
The final offer came from an unexpected source, not one of the wealthy individuals or institutions that had been circling since the announcement, but from a consortium of automotive museums and preservation organizations that had quietly assembled in the weeks after the discovery became public. Their bid valued the complete collection at $52 million, not the highest figure that had been proposed, but accompanied by commitments that spoke to something beyond mere financial calculation. The collection would be kept intact, initially housed in a purpose-built facility that would be constructed specifically to preserve and display these vehicles. Public access would be provided, the cars becoming available for enthusiasts, students, and casual visitors to experience rather than disappearing into private collections where only privileged few might ever see them. Individual vehicles would be loaned to other museums for special exhibitions, their stories shared with audiences worldwide rather than hoarded in one location. Restoration work would be undertaken thoughtfully, prioritizing preservation over transformation, maintaining originality even when that meant accepting imperfection, the goal being to stabilize and protect rather than to make everything pristine and new. And the detail that ultimately convinced Marcus to recommend acceptance: the collection would be named in Leonard Ashford's honor. His story told alongside the vehicle stories. His vision and passion finally receiving the recognition that his life's trajectory had denied him. The family, focused primarily on the financial return, accepted based on the dollar figure alone. Their disinterest in the broader implications evident, but ultimately irrelevant given that the price met their expectations. The legal documentation took months to finalize. Teams of attorneys negotiating terms and conditions, establishing endowment for ongoing maintenance, creating governance structures that would outlast any individual administrator. The actual transfer occurred on a brilliant October morning, professional transport trucks arriving to carefully load each vehicle for the journey to temporary storage while the permanent facility underwent construction. Marcus watched the barn empty with emotions he couldn't entirely parse. Satisfaction at having preserved Leonard's collection, warring with melancholy at seeing the barn return to the emptiness that had characterized it before Leonard had filled it with his treasures. When the last car had been loaded and the trucks had departed down the gravel road, Marcus walked through the empty building one final time, his footsteps echoing in the space that felt both larger and somehow diminished without the vehicles that had defined it for 4 decades. Stains on the concrete marked where each car had rested, shadows of their presence, ghosts of rubber and oil. Dust still hung in the air, disturbed by the removal process, the particular scent of old automobiles still perceptible beneath the barn's mustiness. Marcus stood in the center of the empty space, imagining Leonard as he must have been before the stroke, visiting his collection, perhaps sitting in the driver's seats and remembering roads driven, perhaps simply walking among the cars and appreciating their lines and engineering, finding in these machines something that the human world couldn't provide. It was a poignant image, made more so by knowing how it had ended, by understanding that Leonard's final decades had passed without him being able to access this sanctuary, his treasures rotting slowly nearby, while his capacity to care for them or even remember them clearly had eroded in parallel. But perhaps, Marcus thought, this ending redeemed that tragedy at least partially, gave Leonard's vision an afterlife that extended beyond his own mortality,
ensured that his passion and judgment in assembling this remarkable collection would be recognized and celebrated rather than simply liquidated for maximum financial return. The barn itself would be demolished as planned, the Ashford estate transformed into residential development, no physical trace remaining of what had transpired here. But the cars would survive, would be preserved and protected, would tell their story and Leonard's story to anyone interested enough to listen. A legacy more enduring than bronze monuments or marble inscriptions. One measured in maintained machines and preserved history rather than words carved in stone. Marcus locked the barn door for the final time, the padlock closing with a click that seemed to seal not just a building but an entire chapter of automotive history, marking the transition from discovery to preservation, from private obsession to public treasure, from forgotten mystery to celebrated triumph of rescue and renewal.